Hello there, good evening. 2 years since the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. I'll speak to former President Trump's national security advisor. Also, the tragic situation in Idaho. I'll speak to Ashleigh Banfield of News Nation and the ongoing race for Speaker of the House of Representatives. I'll get insight and analysis on that. This week marks 2 years since the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol. Joining me now to discuss not only that, but what he makes of some of the biggest political events of the past few days, as well as so much more, is the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and the former National Security Advisor to President Trump, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for making the time.
Glad to be back with you.
Let's just begin with something that isn't necessarily relevant to the titles that you've previously held, but is still very much impacting the American political scene as the vote for Speaker of the House takes place. What do you make of what's been happening as of late? And do you ultimately believe Kevin McCarthy will be able to secure enough votes today?
Well, it's certainly been a long time since the speakership has not been determined on the first ballot. That's true, but in earlier days in American history, this was not untypical. So I don't necessarily view the confusion of January the 3rd as being indicative of what will come later. Sometimes these really are tempests in a teapot, and things move on. But it's very uncertain at the moment, and with a very narrow majority, I don't think anybody can really predict what's going to happen. My guess is that those who are opposed to Kevin McCarthy believe they don't need an alternative. What they want to do is veto him, which they are effectively doing at the moment, and then worry about who would actually become the speaker later. So they're in a very strong tactical position. And after 3 votes where McCarthy's position is not improving, in fact, it's declining somewhat, I think his chances are on the downhill slope at this point.
And when you look at the fact that this week marks 2 years since January the 6th, what are you going to be thinking about as this week marks 2 years since January 6th, and what do you think the American people should be reflecting on?
Well, I think January the 6th was one of the saddest days in American history. There's no doubt about it. But I think what people need to look at, and I mean, including not just January the 6th, but the whole effort to contest the 2020 election without evidence. And what happened is, it's certainly true that Donald Trump and his friends stressed the constitutional system, but in every material respect, the system held. So I think it's a mistake to draw overbroad conclusions from insufficient data. What Trump did was aberrational. It was obviously unacceptable, but I don't think that it really foreshadows the way ahead. We're in a very divided partisan political environment right now. Trump was part of the cause for that, but far from the only cause.
And as we move forward, I know you've made comments surrounding you would potentially be making a 2024 bid if that's what it takes to ensure Donald Trump does not end up in the White House again. Speak to the reasoning behind you saying that, and when can people maybe expect to hear more?
Well, I was very disturbed by the lack of reaction of the current field of potential Republican candidates for president when Trump said that the Constitution should be terminated, key provisions of it should be terminated so that he could be declared the winner of the 2020 election. That's about as outrageous as anything Trump has said. But what really surprised and disturbed me, as I say, was the lack of direct rejection of that argument by many of the potential wannabes. I looked at running for president very seriously in 2016. It's a substantial decision to make. I'm still considering it. I do think it's important that if you get into the race, it's to get in to win, not simply to make a point. So I'm still talking to people all around the country, and I don't plan to think on it forever, but I'm not at this point ready to make a decision.
Okay, that's the former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump and the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Ambassador, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you. Thanks again.
On the News Nation network, there are many shows. News Nation aims to be an independent, unbiased news outlet that is very different from perhaps what you might expect when you tune into one of the major networks like CNN or NBC or Fox News or ABC or whatever the case may be. Joining me now is Ashleigh Banfield. She's the host of her program on that network, Banfield, talking about crime and justice and lots of different stories. And of course, at the heart of her coverage on her program these past few weeks has been the tragic story of the Idaho college murders. And she joins me now to discuss not only that, but her exclusive interview that she had just recently. Ashleigh, thanks so much for making the time.
Hey, Wyatt, it's a real pleasure to talk to someone as clever and smart and as engaged in the news as you are.
Let's start out with that exclusive interview that you had. What was that like, and what did you ultimately take from that interview? Because obviously we talked a little bit about before we started shooting this segment that to many news stories, there are the details that you have to report on, but you also have, the way you feel and your emotions that come along with it. And so what's that like being at the heart of really this tragic story?
Well, that's a great question. And I will be honest with you, it sometimes is one of the hardest things that I do is just to keep from crying while I'm talking to people whose lives are falling apart. And last night I did this interview with the parents of one of the Idaho college murder victims, Kaylee Gonzalez's parents, Steve and Christy Gonzalez. And they had just that morning, for the first time, laid eyes on the man who's accused of killing their daughter and the three other kids who lived with her. And so it was an extraordinarily emotional day for them. The interview came through really sort of last minute. And then as I was on the air, I was told in my IFB, that's the little earpiece that broadcasters wear, that it wouldn't just be Steve Gonzalez, it would be Steve and his wife, Christy. So I had to sort of, on the fly, incorporate an entirely different interview that would have both mom and dad. And Wyatt, journalists ask questions, they have to get information, but at the same time, they have to walk a very fine tightrope about the sensitivities of the subject and the subject matter. And the subjects in my interview were apoplectic in terms of their tragic loss and their sadness. So asking pro forma questions of people like that is pretty hard to do. So you have to come at it with a humanity and a real sense of personhood as opposed to journalist. And that's the tricky part, especially when you're live and you're juggling time constraints and instructions for getting to break and new guests you weren't expecting. So, that was it. That was a tricky interview, but I will say it was an astounding interview because they had to navigate a really difficult question, and that is whether they wanted the death penalty for the accused killer of their daughter. And a lot of parents feel very differently about that. Some absolutely want it, and others don't for moral reasons. And others don't because they want a perpetrator to suffer even longer. They look at the death penalty as an easy way out. And so last night, the parents said they did want the death penalty, and it is an option in Idaho.
What do you gather has been the impact on a community with these Idaho college murders?
So again, great question. The Moscow community is small, right? It's like 11,000 people and then another 11,000 or so students. So 25,000 people in that community. They're bewildered. They hadn't had a murder in this town for 7 years. And then all of a sudden, not only a quadruple murder, but also one that's under the national Klieg lights, right? All of a sudden, the spotlight of the nation is on this very small, quaint, lovely. It's like Banff. It's like a sweet community, right? Just beautiful, bucolic, peaceful. And so their worlds have all been upside down. They've been terrified that there's been this maniacal killer on the loose, and every one of them has been afraid. And now they're just trying to process what's happened to one of their neighbors, four of their neighbors. And so nationally speaking, it's also been pretty overwhelming because, Wyatt, at your age, it's hard to process this, but people like me can't imagine sending our kids off to university and then having the unthinkable happen. The scenario you don't plan for. You plan for them drinking too much. You plan for them maybe taking drugs. You plan for them getting in trouble at school, but you never plan for the unimaginable, something that's just out of a Hollywood movie. So the rest of the country has been trying to process a mystery that hasn't made any sense.
I want to kind of allude back to your first answer when you did your interview with the parents last night. What did they say as to just, their children and how this is going to obviously impact them as a family, because obviously it's going to do that greatly, and just about what you just mentioned, sending your child off to college and not expecting any of this or preparing for absolutely any of this to happen.
I mean, they had 5 kids. Now they have 4. And they did touch upon the lives of those 4 kids and trying to help them mentally process what's happened to their family. Because again, there's no playbook for this, right? There's no directions for how to get through life when you've lost your sister or your brother, or your cousin or your daughter. And so while parents are, overcoming this just raw horror in their world, the kids are too. And the parents have to now help those kids to get through this and to see and to notice what's going on in their kids' mental health. And they acknowledge that's a big job. And I'll tell you something else, Wyatt. A year ago, when I covered the disappearance and then the tragic death of Gabby Petito, Joe Petito and I became quite friendly. And we have communicated ever since. I've never met him in person because he lives in a different state. But he said to me that when I introduced him to John Walsh, who's the host of America's Most Wanted and many other syndicated programs like that, John Walsh told him that after he lost his son, Adam, one of the biggest things he learned was how to make sure his other children were going to be okay. And John Walsh passed that lesson on to Joe Petito. And Joe Petito said to me it was the best thing that ever happened to him in that horror that he went through. He realized what he was neglecting to do because he was so overwhelmed with his own sadness. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to be able to do is connect Joe Petito to the Gonzalez family, and then they can connect to the Mogans and the Chapins and to the Kernodles. And hopefully he can give them some of that wisdom as well. Because can you imagine being a member of this club all of a sudden? Can you just imagine your family being a part of this unbearable, awful lifetime membership that you never, ever wanted an invitation to, and you're in nonetheless?
Okay, Ashleigh Banfield, the host of News Nation's Banfield. Thanks so much, Ashleigh, for joining me and for obviously explaining this devastating story. Thanks so much.
Wyatt, it's great to meet you, and I see wonderful things in your future, young man. I can't wait to work with you one day.
Thanks so much. As Kevin McCarthy tries to seek the number of votes required, 218, to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, a lot happening on the floor of the House of Representatives, including Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz, as an example, putting forward former President Donald Trump as a nominee to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, also previously nominated yesterday and in many other days that this has been going on. People such as Jim Jordan, lots of people as well, Byron Donald, so many people joining me now to discuss what we can make of all of this, what it means for the Democratic Party and just for American politics in general. Is Ian Keldrin. He was the former majority leader in the California State Assembly. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Wyatt.
Let's just start out with how truly historic this moment is. The fact that, with how many ballots that congressional representatives have now voted on, the fact that despite a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, the Democrats have still been ahead on every ballot.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's historic in the sense that it just hasn't happened in over a century that we've had to go to this many ballots. Or 1923, it went to a 9th ballot for a reelection of an existing speaker. It's historic, but also at the same time, this was something that quite a lot of folks saw as being a potential reality for Kevin McCarthy just because of the slim majority that he had. I mean, there was a lot of concern. Obviously, that was expressed by the Republicans after this last midterm election, in part due to the policies of the Republican Party and a lot of the things that, they're, proclaiming to be their priorities and the American people to a large degree, which was historic for our midterm elections, really rejecting that and giving them only a very, very, very slim majority. when usually in a midterm election, opposition party from the president generally does pretty well. So, this was something that in a lot of ways was foreseeable, and kind of their own creation, in terms of how they've been handling things and handling issues in themselves over the last few years.
And what does it say about, the fact that every single Democrat on the floor of the House of Representatives has voted for Hakeem Jeffries, but in the Republican Party, there at some points have been, 3 different candidates running for the House of Representatives and Speaker on the Republican side. What does that say as to the unity aspect of things?
Well, I mean, in terms of the Democratic side of things, you have to go back to the decision of Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker, and the decision of her entire leadership team to stand aside. That's very different than what you normally see. Generally, when there's a change in leadership, it's because a change was desired and it was taken. Leadership was taken, and even here in California, nobody's handed a speakership. It's taken. It's earned and then it's taken. And when you take a look at how that played out and what that means for the Democratic caucus, you were going to be able to see that this was going to be a unified caucus moving forward. And I quite honestly, I think that's, in a lot of ways, it's not just where the Democratic caucus is, but I think it's, an understanding too of where the American people are. I think, there's been a lot of vitriol in this country for a couple of years now. And I think you're seeing sentiments change amongst people, voters that want to see difference, and that want to see a different tone from their leaders. They want to see government do, what it was intended to do, to try to make things a little bit better, a little bit easier for the average person. And on the Republican side, I mean, this is politics. These types of things happen, but you just have a handful of folks within that caucus that are refusing to vote for Kevin McCarthy, and I think that that's for a lot of reasons. I think, mainly from what you can deduce based on reporting, is that it's personality based. They just don't like him. And then like him probably for reasons that, are relatively obvious, in terms of him not being a hardliner enough, him not being able to, give them and, their wishes more credence, being that he represents the establishment and they don't consider themselves the establishment. But I mean, they have a really, really, really big problem in their caucus. And we dealt with this when I was in leadership in the legislature in California. You have to have a unified caucus, because every member that peels away, it undermines not only the power of your leadership, but it undermines your ability to get things done, to work, and to be able to properly negotiate with not just the Senate, but also the president. So it says a lot of good things. It doesn't say a lot of, it says a lot of good things for the Democratic caucus. It does not say a lot of good things for the Republican caucus. And it's going to be interesting to see how they try to get out of this, because you're looking at a speakership that's going to be extremely neutered. And the job that you would count on the speaker to do is going to be significantly impacted in a negative way, to being able to carry out the most simple, basic functions of what that office is supposed to carry out. Because at any point in time, one member can stand up and say, like Matt Gaetz can say, I object, I want to call move to vacate the chair, and they have to do a vote to determine whether or not the speaker stays the speaker or not. And that is an extremely hostile environment that isn't going to be conducive to getting anything done.
And I suppose, just lastly, moving forward, what is your overall hypothesis, prediction as to what you foresee will come out of this, and what can people make of where we're at now?
Well, it can go a lot of different ways. I mean, in politics, things can change on a dime. It can change very quickly. But there are at least 5 members within the Republican caucus right now that will refuse to vote for Kevin McCarthy, and he can only afford to lose 4. It takes 218 votes. There are 222 Republican members. He can only lose 4 and still be speaker, or become speaker and stay speaker. He needs he can't afford to have 5 oppose him. And there are at least 5 members in that caucus that are, at least at this point in time, saying they will never vote for him. So it really begs the question if Kevin McCarthy is going to have any opportunity to do this at all, to make this happen. And, I said it a couple of days ago, and I still believe it. I do not believe that Kevin McCarthy is going to be the speaker. It's going to have to be some type of consensus candidate, but I don't know who that's going to be. And the longer this drags out, I don't know that it lends itself to some type of concession where everybody agrees to vote for a consensus candidate. I think people start to dig in a lot more. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And at this point, McCarthy has said he doesn't want any deal with any Democrats. I mean, he'd only need a few. And you do have a couple of Democrats that have said they might be willing to consider some type of consensus candidate or some type of potential deal to maybe do it. But I mean, I think what I would like to see is I'd like to see Representative Jeffries, the minority leader, the leader of the Democratic caucus, talking to minority Republicans and just saying, hey, this is crazy. We can't function. We cannot carry out our duties, the duties that you were elected to do. There's quite a few members that are representing very, very blue districts. We're heading into a presidential election cycle in 2025, right? In 2 years. Or 2024. So what you're looking at is, a situation where it could be beneficial for some Republicans to jump on and potentially support Representative Jeffries with some major concessions to them to be speaker. Now, it's not likely, but I certainly hope he's at least having some conversations to explore that path.
Okay, Ian Keldrin, former majority leader in the California State Assembly. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
All right, Wyatt. Thanks for having me.
The House of Representatives is still trying to elect a successor to Nancy Pelosi to lead the House of Representatives, to appoint various people to various committees, as well as obviously be third in line for the presidency. Joining me now to discuss all of that is Michael Starr Hopkins. He was a senior advisor to Charlie Crist's gubernatorial campaign. He served on Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's presidential campaigns as well. And he joins me now. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Let's just start out. We have these reports coming from various media outlets at this point in time that Lauren Boebert is considering a vote to vote present in the next round of balloting for the House Speaker's election, meaning that leaves a very small number of people that lie between Kevin McCarthy not winning the speakership versus Kevin McCarthy receiving the threshold, which is, of course, 218 votes. As a Democrat yourself, do you think there will be regret amongst Democrats when, it comes time to realize that they didn't, pursue the route that many are talking about in selecting maybe a more moderate Republican in a certain sense? Because obviously Kevin McCarthy is fairly conservative.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think this is the only time that Kevin McCarthy is going to have to deal with having to rankle votes to stay in power should he become the speaker. They're lowering the threshold for what can be used as basically a vote of no confidence for the speaker. And I think when you have things like the debt ceiling coming up, should he become speaker, he's going to get challenged every day. I think at this point, Kevin McCarthy is the only person that wants Kevin McCarthy to be speaker. I think people are just sick of voting. I mean, we're at what, vote 14 at this point?
And I mean, that is fair. I mean, it's taken this many rounds, and even still, when he does win the speakership, it might be by 1 or by 2 votes. It's not going to be by a very large number, because you still have these what are being called never Kevins, members of Congress who are just refusing to vote for him by practically every standard. When it comes to, though, as I mentioned, the more moderate Republican factions within the Republican Party, and then Hakeem Jeffries, obviously that is the Democrats' preferred candidate. Everybody knows that. And the Democrats seem to be very much united behind him, not having anybody within the Democratic caucus having to object behind him becoming the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. But there is talk about the fact that you don't have to be a member of the House of Representatives to be elected as Speaker of the House. So do you think that there is a possibility of any sense that it would have been, better to say choose someone who isn't in the House of Representatives, who can be seen as kind of a negotiator between Republicans and Democrats?
I think we're at a point in our political society where there's not a lot of room for negotiation. And the idea that Democrats and Republicans are going to come together to find a unity candidate, I think, is naive on a lot of our parts. I wish that was something that could happen, but I think that's only true in shows like West Wing at this point.
And so moving forward, if the Republicans are going to have control of the House of Representatives, at the end of the day, the House of Representatives, the Senate, both bodies of the United States Congress are there to try and get things done for the American people. So if the Republicans have a Speaker of the House who doesn't seem to be very unified within his own caucus, it's not like he's being, unanimously chosen here as the Republican nominee for Speaker of the House of Representatives. How can things actually get done for the American people if the Republicans hold the majority and they're barely united behind their own leader?
Well, I think that's why that very question is why voters made sure that there was no red wave in 2022. And I think Republicans are in a precarious position heading into 2024. Everyone knows that they're obstructionists. They know that they don't have serious policies to run on. And so their plan for the next years is chaos. That's not a plan that's going to work with the voters. And so I think what we're seeing now is just a continuation of what we're going to see moving forward, and the country will suffer for it.
Right, but when you look at what took place in the midterm elections with the Democrats losing the House of Representatives, mind you, it wasn't by a very large number. It was a very close midterms. They retained control of the Senate. They actually gained in the Senate, winning an additional seat in the United States Senate with 51-49. So moving forward, it's not going to be as easy, you could say, obviously for the Biden administration and for the Democrats to pass the legislation that they want to get passed, but it's also not going to be easy for the Republicans to get past what they want to get passed, considering it seems to be such a divided Republican caucus. So what do you make of that?
Look, I think there are areas where we can compromise. I think, trying to pass more common sense gun legislation. I think there should be conversations about codifying Roe. Those are things that I think that we should be able to find enough consensus on. When you look at the approval ratings for Roe, when you look at the approval ratings for better gun law, or better gun legislation, rather, those numbers are extremely high. It's only in Washington and Congress that it's hard to compromise on those kind of things. So I think, where we can work together, we can work together. But there are fundamental issues between the two parties that aren't going to get solved, are not going to get solved overnight. And I think immigration is a perfect example of that.
So just, I guess, following up on one of the things you mentioned, Roe versus Wade as an example. Obviously, that was, when you look at what took place in June and just before last summer, that was primarily done by conservative justices on the courts.
Selected by Republicans.
Exactly. So what makes you think, I suppose, then, that Republican members of Congress are willing to work to come to some sort of a consensus around that?
Well, based on the shellacking that they took in the midterms, they'd be stupid to not look at some sort of compromise when it comes to a woman's right to choose. I mean, that was one of the main driving factors in why Republicans lost. And if they leave that issue on the table again for Democrats to run on, it's going to be a really rough cycle.
And then, just lastly, before we conclude, when you look at how the House of Representatives will be shaped after the election to elect a new Speaker of the House of Representatives, obviously not having control of the House of Representatives means you won't be able to chair any of the major committees in the House of Representatives. And again, as we've both alluded to, it will be overall harder to pass the legislation that the Democrats want to get passed, the Biden administration wants to get passed. How can President Biden fulfill some of the commitments that he made in the presidential election that still haven't been fulfilled as of yet in with not having the Democrats control the House of Representatives and moving forward into the next presidential election, he says he's going to run again. What can he ultimately do to convince Americans to give the Democrats control of the House of Representatives again so that they can pass the legislation that he wants passed?
Well, let me say, I've been critical of the president at times, but I think he has had two of the most consequential years of almost any president in our history. His ability to pass gun legislation, to pass economic legislation, to respond to COVID, I think are the types of actions that history will not just look kindly upon, but will study. As to him running in a second term, the Democratic Party is unified around Joe Biden. I said that he should look at whether or not it made sense for him to run a second term, given all of his successes in the first one. But he has proven an ability to work across the lines. He has proven an ability to be a steady hand. And I think heading into 2024, there's going to be a very clear distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are a return to chaos, and Democrats are the steady hand that make sure that people get shots in their arms, and their kids are going to school, and unemployment's dropping.
All right, Michael Starr Hopkins, former senior advisor to Charlie Crist's gubernatorial campaign. And he previously, as I mentioned in the introduction, also served on Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's campaigns for president. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, man. You take care.
You too.